against incest. No culture in the world allows marriage or sexual relationships within this group. Now, I have to admit, there are a couple of very rare exceptions. The Hawaiian nobility, the Egyptian kings and queens, this idea that where royalty is descended from the gods and the bloodline has to be kept pure, they allow brother and sister marriage occasionally. But these are very rare cases. And for the most part, every culture in the world prohibits sexual relations between brothers and sisters and parents and children. But the range of incestuous relatives is culturally defined. Is first cousin marriage incestuous? Most people would agree. What about second cousin marriage? Most people would still agree, but where do we draw the line? At what point does incest start? In the Western tradition, our prohibitions against incest come from the Judeo-Christian tradition, come from the Bible. In particular, chapter 18 in Leviticus, verse 6, and in parts of chapter 20 of Leviticus as well, where we find a number of prohibitions listed. For example, do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. Do not have relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with your sister, and so forth. But this isn't a very wide range of relatives that are prohibited. One is not supposed to have sexual relations with parents, with aunts or uncles, with grandchildren, and so forth. But it's a very narrow range of what is explicitly prohibited in Leviticus. But beyond that, the Catholic Church started expanding out what was considered to be incestuous. And in AD 385, Pope Theodosius I prohibited first cousin marriage. This wasn't prohibited in the Bible. It wasn't found in the Scripture. But the Pope decided that that was a little bit too close and prohibited it. And then gradually, the Catholic Church expanded out the range of what was considered to be incestuous. So that by AD 1059, Pope Nicholas II prohibited marriage to the 7th degree. Prohibited marriage to the 7th degree. That means that you couldn't marry. You would have your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-great-grandfather, and any of their descendants would be prohibited from marriage. So let's say if you're living in rural France in the 11th century, you can't marry anybody. Nobody in your village would be eligible to be married. But of course there was an exception. You could buy a dispensation from the church. You could buy the right to marry your second cousin or your third cousin or even your first cousin. So one intent, whether it was intentional or not, of the Catholic Church's expansion of the incest prohibition was an increase in the sales of dispensations, of licenses to break canonical law. Now, the range of what was considered to be incestuous was gradually shrunk back in the Catholic tradition. In 1215, it was reduced to 4 degrees. In 1537, it was reduced to 2 degrees. It was reduced for South American Indians first, and then later for descendants of Africans in 1917. It was reduced to 2 degrees. And finally, it was reduced to 2 degrees for everyone in the world. But this prohibition, some sort of prohibition against incest, is found in all cultures. And why might this be? Well, the obvious answer that comes to mind is inbreeding. We don't marry our relatives because of the dangers of having recessive genes come to the fore. There's one study that has found that the children of very close incestuous relationships are 8 times more likely to be born with birth defects. Now, this is true, but it doesn't help us understand why there are different cultural conceptions of what is incest. Why the group that is considered incestuous varies from culture to culture. Is marrying your second cousin incest? What if your second cousin was adopted? Would that be incest? Most people would still consider it to be incest, but it's adopted, so there's not a biological relationship there. So incest is cultural. It's a social prohibition. Inbreeding is a partial answer, but it's an incomplete explanation for fully explaining incest taboos. The scholar Edward Westermarck offered another explanation, and he coined the phrase, familiarity breeds contempt. And this is from his 1891 work, The History of the Human Marriage. And what he means here is that if you're raised with someone day in and day out, like a brother or a sister, even if they're not your biological brother or sister, it's a turnoff. It's not romantic. Sexual relationships won't flourish because growing up together mutes that kind of lust and sexuality. Now, in the last decades, a few studies have been done that give support to the idea that familiarity breeds contempt. And the most famous were done in kibbutzim in Israel. Kibbutzim, the communal communities in Israel that were started in the 1950s, and there were studies done in the 1960s and 1970s looking at marriage patterns and looking at sexual relationships between people who were raised on very traditional kibbutzim. And on these rigid kibbutzim, children would be raised in dormitories away from their parents. They would visit their parents every day, but they would be raised as a cohort away from their parents. So they're raised with this peer group, intimately seeing each other every day, boys and girls, men and women, as they grow up. And so one study looked at 125 couples that had been raised since birth on the same kibbutz, and none of them got married to each other. None of them. And you expect, who would you find for a potential mate? I mean, the obvious example would be someone that you were living with day in and day out. This would be an obvious pool of potential marriage partners. But none of the people in the study married one another. There have been other studies that show that there are very few sexual relations as well among youths on kibbutzim. Now, the other example I wanted to mention that moves toward proving this hypothesis that familiarity breeds contempt was done by the anthropologist Arthur Wolf. And he worked with the Chinese exile community living in Taiwan. And he noticed that there was a prevalence of a certain type of marriage called the simpois marriage. The simpois marriage is infant betrothal. And it's normally done by very poor families who can't afford to raise their child, especially a daughter, and so they betroth their daughter at a very early age. Sometimes as early as 6 or 7 months, sometimes as old as 3 or 4 years, but betrothing them to their future husband at a very early age. The girl then goes and lives with her future husband's family and is raised like a sister. They very often sleep in the same bed, they bathe together, they eat together. It's just like she becomes a daughter in this family, until she comes of age. And then she's expected to marry who she's been living with as a brother and live the rest of her life in marriage that way. So Arthur Wolf looked at these marriages to see how successful they were. He found that the fertility rate was 30% lower than other sorts of marriage. So something's going on here. The fertility rate was 30% lower. He started interviewing people who were in simpois marriages, and he found out that these marriages were incredibly tumultuous. The husbands were more likely to cheat on their wives. They were more avid consumers of prostitutes and pornography. There was lots of familial strife, domestic abuse, and a high rate of divorce. And Wolf concludes that it's because familiarity breeds contempt. These children were raised with one another since infants, just as if they were brother and sister. And then when it came the moment to initiate the marriage, to have sexual relationships, both sides, the boys and the girls, very often refused. There are accounts of mothers having to use a broom and force the children into the bridal chamber to consummate this marriage. So, does incest have a biological basis? Probably, potentially. Are there also important cultural, psychological factors going on here as well? Most certainly. Does marriage have an evolutionary cause? Perhaps to facilitate pair bonding, it makes a lot of sense. But as we've seen, marriage is conceived of very differently in cultures around the world. We have arranged marriages. We have multiple spouses. We have these infant betrothals of the simpois marriage. Even our kinship terms, which seem so natural to us, are cultural constructions. Yes, they're based on biological relationships, but we extend that out to step siblings and adopted siblings and so forth. And so we see here the importance of culture. And in the next lecture, we're going to apply these concepts of kinship and culture to the Trobriand Islanders.